Didn't I tell you, you need a wife? Abigail's words cut through the red dust square like the swing of a hammer against the closed-off heart of a man undone by grief. Jonah stood on the weathered porch, arms trembling as he clutched the wailing newborn, his face hollowed by sleepless nights, nothing more than a shadow drifting across the cold prairie. Abigail stepped closer, her fingers tightening around the folded list of mail-order brides, her steady gaze piercing through the exhaustion that clung to Jonah like a shroud. The child's cries mingled with the restless wind, rising into a mournful hymn of loss. And there, between the weight of sorrow and the glimmer of hope, lingered the unspoken question. Who would have the strength to draw Jonah out of the abyss? Abigail with her unyielding resolve, or some unseen hand of fate waiting just beyond the horizon? Dakota Territory, spring of 1872. The Whitaker homestead sat like a weary sentinel on the edge of the prairie, its clapboard siding weather-worn and gray, roof shingles sagging under years of storms. Smoke drifted from the chimney in a thin, uneven line, as though the house itself exhaled in exhaustion. Beyond its door, silence was shattered by the weak, urgent cries of a newborn, the sound traveling out into the wide and lonely expanse. Jonah Whitaker stood in the doorway, framed by failing timber and peeling paint. He looked less like a man than a shadow stretched thin by grief. His eyes were hollowed from sleepless nights, his cheeks drawn and pale. In his arms he clutched the bundle of his infant daughter, her tiny face scrunched red with hunger and sorrow. The child's cries rattled through his chest, turning his every muscle taut, as if letting go, even for an instant, would cause his whole world to collapse. From the far end of the dirt track, a figure approached, each step stirring clouds of red dust. Abigail Moore, the matchmaker of Hollow Creek, walked with the steady purpose of a woman who had carried decisions heavier than her satchel of letters and names. Her wide-brimmed hat was faded by sun and storm, her coat hem darkened by long miles. In one hand she held a folded list, ink and parchment that might alter fates. Her boots pressed deep into the parched earth, each footprint declaring a certainty. This path had been chosen long before her feet touched it. Jonah saw her coming, a lone silhouette against the horizon. His first instinct was to turn his back, to slam the door and retreat into silence. He had no appetite for company, least of all for a woman who made her living arranging futures he no longer believed in. But the child in his arms wailed louder, and fatigue drained away his strength to resist. When Abigail reached the porch, the wind tugged at her coat, revealing eyes that had grown practiced at reading the loneliness carved into men's faces. She wasted no time with pleasantries. Her voice cut across the yard like the clear ring of iron striking an anvil. "You need a wife, Jonah, not just a nursemaid." The words landed hard, reverberating against the closed door of his heart. Jonah's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a line as rigid as his will. The reply came low, defensive, stripped of grace. "I don't need anyone. Just someone to feed the baby. That's all." Abigail did not yield. She set her hand against the weather-worn doorframe, her slender fingers steady as oak roots. Her gaze held his, red-rimmed eyes dulled by sleeplessness and despair. "You haven't slept in 2 days. Your arms shake as if this child weighs more than the whole prairie. Do you think she needs nothing more than survival? She needs a home, a mother's steadiness, a man beside her who is more than a shadow stumbling through the dark." Her words were not harsh nor tender. They were truth, bare as the wind that scraped the land clean of grass. Jonah's head dipped, the weight of her statement pressing into him. For a flicker of a moment, his resolve faltered. He held the infant tighter, as if clutching her closer would somehow prove he was enough. But his ragged breathing betrayed the truth Abigail had already seen. She let her gaze fall to the child wrapped in the frayed blanket. A face barely formed, flushed with hunger, lips trembling for comfort. In those damp eyes, Abigail glimpsed more than a baby's need. She saw the echo of a void, the hollow left by death and absence, a space one man alone could not hope to fill. She had walked this road many times. She had paired lonely miners with widows, young seamstresses with farmers who owned little more than hope. Yet Jonah was different. From the first glance she felt it. This was not a man merely in need of companionship. He was a man whose heart had been sealed shut with grief as tight as iron rivets. Convincing him would not be a matter of logic or convenience. Her voice softened, though her resolve did not. You don't have to promise me anything, but you must face what is before you. This child deserves more than trembling arms. And you, Jonah, you deserve more than the hollow of your own shadow. The wind rose, carrying red dust that settled on her boots and the porch boards. Jonah stood unmoving, caught between the pride that urged him to dismiss her and the exhaustion that pulled him towards surrender. At last, with a weary exhale, he shifted aside, pushing the door open. It was not welcome, nor agreement. It was merely what remained of a man too tired to keep resisting. Abigail stepped inside, her boots tapping against warped floorboards. The air hung heavy with smoke gone stale, with spilled milk soured on cloth, with the rank of damp corners neglected too long. Every surface spoke of abandonment, of a household left adrift when its anchor was torn away. The door closed behind her, muting the prairie's howl. In the dim interior, they stood across from one another, one man hollowed by grief, one woman bearing the weight of decisions. Between them, the infant's thin cries pierced the gloom, demanding care with a force neither could ignore. Abigail looked once more at Jonah. His features were hard, but his hands trembled around the small bundle, and his eyes carried the sheen of a storm long held back. Something shifted between them then, silent but undeniable. She read in his face the faintest admission that perhaps she was right, that perhaps he could not do this alone. Her gaze steadied, both resolute and compassionate. The moment held, suspended like dust in a shaft of weak light. In that stillness, an unspoken understanding took root. Something was about to change. Whether it would bind them together or tear them further apart, neither yet knew. But change, relentless as the prairie wind, had already arrived. The Whitaker house was thick with smoke and shadow, its gloom no less suffocating than the grief that lingered in its walls. Afternoon light leaked through cracks in the shutters, thin shafts cutting across the dust that lay over the furniture, the hearth, the stacked dishes in the sink. Milk had curdled into a sour film on the counter. Ashes clung stubbornly to the stove, and a musty dampness seemed to settle into every corner. In the far side of the room, an old rocker creaked softly each time the wind pressed against the house, though no one sat there anymore. Abigail stepped forward, her boots sounding hollow against the dry boards. Each detail struck her with the weight of truth. This was not simply a neglected house. It was the visible trail of a man unraveling, of a spirit that had lost its tether. Every object left untouched spoke of a woman who had only just vanished from here, vanished to the grave, leaving behind a space no one else could fill. Jonah said nothing. He set the baby into a wicker basket near the hearth, the tiny form fussing before settling into hiccuping breaths. His shoulders sagged, as if bearing a yoke too heavy to throw off. For a long moment the room held only the baby's faint whimpers and the sound of firewood collapsing into embers. The room at the end of the hall, Jonah muttered at last, eyes fixed on the flames. If you insist on staying, that's where you'll be. Don't expect more than 4 walls. Abigail gave a single nod, placing her small satchel down by the door. His words were no welcome, merely surrender. She had seen it before, the gesture of a man too tired to resist further. For her purpose, that was enough. She turned toward the hallway, her steps slow. Then she paused, looking back. Jonah remained motionless before the fire, the glow sharpening the hollows of his gaunt face. It was in that fragile pause that Abigail let the truth slip, her voice scarcely above a whisper, yet it cut through the silence with a force that stilled the room. Mary was my friend. The air seemed to freeze. Even the snapping of resin in the fire rang loud, intrusive. Jonah's head jerked up, his hollowed eyes locking on her in disbelief. He went pale. For years, Mary had been his private world. His wife, his solace, the woman he had buried only days ago. Her name belonged to him alone. And now it fell from the lips of Abigail Moore, the matchmaker he had always regarded as an outsider, a dealer in arranged fates and strangers' unions. You lie, Jonah rasped, his voice raw. Abigail did not flinch. I knew Mary and Helena. We taught letters together at the church schoolhouse. I left. She stayed. That's when she met you. I never intruded, Jonah. I never stepped between. But don't think I came to your door as a stranger. Jonah's fists closed tight, cords rising along his forearms. His eyes flared with a wounded suspicion, as if she had trespassed on sacred ground. Why would Mary never tell me? His voice cracked under the strain of disbelief. Why would she hide that? Abigail's breath left her in a slow sigh. Perhaps she thought it unimportant. Perhaps she wanted to begin anew with you, unburdened by old ties. But I knew Mary. She did not easily cut away the threads of her past. She spoke of you, even before she wore your ring. And I swear to you, I never thought the day would come when I'd stand in her empty house to say these words. The weight of them fell like stones into still water, rippling through the quiet. Jonah lowered his gaze, fighting the storm that clawed inside him. He wanted to reject it, to deny it, to keep Mary sealed in the memory he had built. But Abigail's voice carried the ring of knowledge no impostor could feign. She took one step nearer, her tone softer, steady with the strength of conviction. Jonah, I did not come to replace Mary, nor to play the role my work requires. I came because of a promise, a vow made long ago. If ever she should fall, I would not let her family crumble into the dust. Jonah's eyes burned red, the firelight reflecting his fury and his grief alike. Do you think words like that can make me believe you? Do you think I will open my door, my life, to a woman who claims friendship when Mary never once spoke your name? You think to wedge yourself into this house by turning my sorrow to your advantage? Abigail stiffened at the sting, her jaw setting. She had known that truth was a blade with 2 edges. It gave her cause to stand in this room, but it also carved suspicion deep into his wounded heart. The silence thickened, pressing close. The child stirred in her basket, a soft whimper curling up into the stale air, as if echoing the unease of her father. Abigail bent down, lifting the wicker gently, her hand soothing along the infant's back. The small body shifted, then settled, a sigh fluttering against her palm. In that simple act, she spoke what her words could not. She was not there to argue. She was there to do what needed doing. "You don't have to believe me today," she said, her voice even, stripped of demand. "But truth does not vanish because it is doubted. I knew Mary in ways you never guessed, and I know she would not bear to see you lost like this." She turned toward the hallway then, the basket cradled against her hip. At the door of the spare room, she paused once more, her back to him, her words carried softly, like the prairie wind through a crack in the door. "You don't owe me trust, Jonah. Not yet. But you must know I am no stranger. And Mary, were she still here, would want me to stay." The door shut with a muted thud. Jonah remained by the hearth, frozen in his chair, his eyes wide and empty. The fire crackled, sparks breaking against the grate, but he heard none of it. Outside, the prairie wind rose, carrying dust in restless swirls across the yard. But the storm that mattered was not out there. It had already been loosed within these walls, birthed by a secret spoken aloud. A secret that had just begun to change everything. Night settled over the Dakota prairie like a massive black quilt, heavy and unbroken. The wind slipped through the cracks of the Whitaker cabin, carrying with it a bitter chill that gnawed at bone and beam alike. Flames in the hearth sputtered against the draft, their light clinging to the room with all the stubbornness of a flame refusing to die. Outside, the plains vanished into a void of darkness, punctuated only by the distant, mournful cry of wolves. Inside the kitchen, Abigail Moore hovered awkwardly over a small pot that hissed and steamed on the stove. She had never learned the rhythm of infant care, never held a child of her own, never mixed milk with any certainty. The glass bottle in her hands trembled slightly as she tried to test the warmth the way she'd heard others describe, dripping a few drops on the inside of her wrist. It felt neither right nor wrong, and doubt swirled through her more fiercely than the steam fogging her spectacles. Behind her, Jonah Whitaker paced the worn boards, his long frame bent rigid around the child he cradled. The baby's cries tore through the air in jagged sobs, raw and relentless. Jonah's jaw clenched hard, the tendons at his neck taut as bowstrings. His boots struck the floor in quick, useless circles, as though walking alone could outpace the storm of grief that echoed in every sound the child made. "She cries for her mother," he muttered hoarsely, his voice more confession than explanation. Abigail turned her head. Through the haze of the lamplight, she caught the trembling in his shoulders. Her answer came quiet but steady, cutting into the silence without cruelty. "And so do you." The words hung there, stark as frost. Jonah froze mid-stride, his eyes dropping to the red-faced infant in his arms. For a long moment, the hardness in his expression cracked, revealing a truth he did not want to face. The fear of failing his daughter, the terror of losing the last fragile thread that tethered him to the life Mary had left behind. Abigail brought the bottle closer, still uncertain of its readiness. Her hand trembled, not from the heat, but from the unfamiliar weight of what she was about to attempt. "Let me try," she said, her palm extended. Jonah hesitated, then lowered the child into her waiting arms. It was an act that looked like surrender, as if he were handing away not only a wailing infant, but the unbearable burden of responsibility itself. Abigail stiffened as the baby's tiny weight pressed into her. Lighter than she expected, yet so heavy it pushed against her heart until her pulse stuttered. The little fists flailed, the mouth opened wide in protest, and the sheer vulnerability of the child struck her like a blow. "Hello there," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I'm Abigail. You're so very small." She brushed the bottle's nipple against the baby's lips. At first, the infant turned away, cries intensifying into sharp wails. Abigail rocked gently, her tone fumbling toward comfort. "Just a little sip, Try, sweet one. Just try." To her surprise, the child latched briefly, sucking a few drops before wailing anew. Abigail's anxious gaze shot to Jonah. He shook his head, exhausted. "I've tried everything. Sometimes she drinks, sometimes she refuses. Maybe she just wants her mother." The words hit the air heavy as stones. Abigail lowered herself onto a chair, nestling the infant closer, her cheek brushing soft wisps of downy hair. Without thinking, she began to hum, fragments of simple tunes she used to teach children in a faraway classroom. The melody was hesitant, broken at first, but as it continued, the wailing softened. Slowly, impossibly, the child quieted, hiccups giving way to drowsy breaths. Jonah halted mid-step. For the first time since Mary's passing, the cabin held a sound that was neither silence nor grief, but a human voice. Tremulous, tender, carrying a rhythm of life. He leaned against the table, his shoulders sagging, his gaze heavy yet softened. A sigh slipped from him, weary and unwilling, as if his chest had forgotten the act of release. "You can rest a while," Abigail murmured without looking up. "I'll hold her." Jonah dragged out a chair across from her and lowered himself down. The firelight revealed his hollowed features, but his eyes lingered on her movements. Though clumsy, there was a gentleness in them, a care that neither of them had expected. Time slowed, measured only by the popping of embers and the even breaths of the child drifting into sleep. Abigail, at last, lowered the baby into the wicker basket, tucking the threadbare blanket around her. Her hand lingered, stroking the fabric as though to reassure herself that the child remained real and safe. Jonah's chest tightened at the sight. Gratitude warred with suspicion. Who was this woman, this firm-voiced matchmaker, Mary's hidden friend, sitting now in his home, humming a stranger's lullaby to his daughter as if it were her duty? Neither spoke further. They moved in quiet rhythm around the basket, each rising in turn to adjust a blanket, to soothe a whimper, to place another log on the fire. Small actions, unnoticed by the world, stitched together into a fragile pattern of survival. It was not trust, not yet. But it was the beginning of something more solid than despair. As the hours wore on, the storm outside pressed harder, rattling the shutters and whistling through every seam of the cabin. Yet within, the glow of firelight threw two shadows against the wall, one tall and hunched with weariness, one smaller, bent in concentration. Their presence together carved out a fragile sanctuary, however temporary. Near dawn, Abigail dozed in her chair, her head drooping toward the basket. Jonah, watching from across the hearth, rose quietly. He drew his heavy coat from its peg and draped it gently across her shoulders. His hand hovered for a breath above her dark hair, enfant, gesture suspended in air, before he withdrew. The baby stirred, sighed, and settled again. Jonah lowered himself beside the fire, his eyes on the coals. For the first time in many nights, grief did not shred him into pieces. It sat there instead like a dull ache, quieter, pushed back by the fragile hum of another presence. That night, his first night not entirely alone with his daughter, was marked by no promises, no spoken bond, only the hush of two people sharing the weight of a child's fragile breath. In the silence they kept, something tentative yet enduring began to kindle. Like the flame in the hearth, wavering but unextinguished, it waited to see if it might grow. The fire in the hearth had burned down low, leaving only a bed of glowing embers. Their dim light flickered across the room, clinging stubbornly to the shadows that pressed in from all sides. It was the kind of light that seemed to fight for survival, wavering, gasping, yet refusing to be snuffed out. Abigail sat near the cradle, listening to the soft rhythm of the baby's breath against her chest. Not long ago, the child's cries had filled the house with a piercing desperation. Now only the fragile hush of sleep remained, a silence delicate as thread, stretched thin between peace and collapse. She drew in a long breath, the scent of sour milk clinging to her dress, and lowered the baby carefully back into the wicker basket near the hearth. Her hand supported the infant's head, then smoothed the thin blanket over its chest. It was in that small motion that her fingers brushed something out of place. At first it seemed no more than a wrinkle in the fabric. But there, near the fold, something dark peeked through, a sliver of brown cloth, unlike the pale blanket around it. Abigail paused. Slowly, she drew the fabric up, revealing a small hand-sewn charm. It was nothing like Mary. The object was an old scrap of cloth, its edges frayed, threads worn from years of touch. On its surface, faint spirals were stitched in a style Abigail recognized, patterns common among the Dakota tribes, meant to shield infants, to summon protection from unseen spirits. The sight of it made her breath catch. Mary had never believed in such things. Practical, even-tempered Mary, who put her trust in prayer and honest work. She would never have carried a talisman like this, let alone tucked it among her daughter's things. Abigail's pulse quickened. The charm did not belong. She lifted her gaze toward Jonah. He sat slumped in a wooden chair a few feet away, elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. It was the posture of a man who had tried and failed to claim rest, whose every nerve still carried the raw weight of grief. When he raised his head at last, their eyes met, and Abigail saw him stiffen, as though he already knew what she had found. "This," she whispered, holding the charm lightly between her fingers. "This isn't Mary's, is it?" Jonah's back straightened, his face gone pale under the shifting glow of the embers. He did not speak at once, his eyes fixed on the charm as though it were something half ghost, half curse. "Don't!" His voice cracked, dry, unwilling. "Don't ask me about that." The words, rough and abrupt, only thickened the silence. The fire popped sharply, a spark leaping against the grate, making the tension all the louder. Jonah's face hardened in the flickering light, but behind it, Abigail caught the glint of something else. Fear, unspoken and unnamed. She laid the charm on the edge of the basket, but did not look away. "If you refuse to explain, Who will? The child is barely 2 weeks old. Who else would place such a thing in her bed? Jonah's hands clenched together, the knuckles whitening. His head dropped, shaking slightly, as though he wrestled with something inside himself. At length his voice came, low, cracked. Maybe someone left it there when I wasn't looking. I don't know. The admission landed like a stone in Abigail's chest. If his words were true, it meant the Whitaker house had been entered, crossed by unseen steps. If they were false, then Jonah himself carried a secret deeper than grief. Either way, the charm was no simple trinket. Abigail said nothing more. Her silence was sharper than any rebuke. Her gaze remained on him, unflinching, and he shifted under it like a man cornered. Suspicion rooted itself in her mind. Not only suspicion of the strange object, but of Jonah himself. The baby stirred in the basket, a soft whimper breaking the taut quiet. Tiny fingers clenched the blanket's edge, lips twitching as though caught between cry and dream. Abigail bent quickly, stroking the small back, murmuring until the child eased again into slumber. The sound of even breathing returned, but the peace was fragile, fragile as glass. Outside, the prairie wind rose, a wild lament lashing against the cabin walls. Inside, Abigail remained seated, her eyes never straying far from the charm. Its spiral stitches seemed almost alive in the flicker of firelight, faint patterns whispering of stories untold. She pulled the blanket back over it at last, as though covering it could bury the unease in her chest. Yet she knew the image would haunt her, the hidden token, waiting like a seed of doubt. Jonah had not moved. His gaze stayed fixed on the darkest corner of the room, as though he saw something there the rest of the world could not. Time crawled. Finally, Abigail rose and, with a careful motion, draped a cloth over the basket, hiding the charm from view. It was a useless act, but she could not bear to look at it any longer. Still, the knowledge remained. This was no keepsake from Mary's gentle hand. It belonged to another, some other presence whose shadow now lingered in the house. She returned to her chair, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fire ebbed lower, the wind outside louder. Sleep tugged at her, heavy with unease. From the chair across the room, Jonah's voice broke the silence again, rough, almost a whisper. Don't speak of it. Not to anyone. Not now. Not ever. His words hung like an oath, heavy and final. Abigail did not answer. She only lowered her head, eyes drifting shut, though her thoughts churned like storm clouds. The baby sighed softly in her sleep, unaware of the weight pressing down around her. And there, in the Whitaker cabin, between two weary adults bound more by circumstance than trust, a secret had been unearthed. A secret wrapped in cloth and stitched with old symbols, carrying with it a warning neither could name. The wind keened outside, rattling the walls, but the true storm was the one awakened within, seeded by a charm in a cradle, and it would not be easily stilled. A week passed quietly on the Dakota prairie. March carried its sharp winds, scouring the land with dust, but inside the Whitaker cabin, life began to move with a rhythm, halting, fragile, yet undeniably different from the suffocating stillness of those first days. Abigail rose early each morning, before the light had broken through the mist lying thick over the fields. Wrapping her shawl tight, she stepped into the barn, where the smell of damp hay and horse sweat clung to the air. Her boots pressed into straw as she dragged buckets, wrestled with ropes, and swept the stalls. She was no natural hand at such work. The broom handle blistered her palms, and the weight of the water left her arms trembling. Her fingers, once skilled with needle and thread, now bore small cracks and scratches, proof that she was slowly learning another kind of craft. Jonah often stood in the doorway of the barn, his arms folded across his chest, his face unreadable. He offered no instructions, no words of encouragement. But the next morning, she found a full bucket set by the door before she reached for one herself. When she bent over awkwardly to tie bundles of hay, she discovered a sturdier twine left neatly coiled in the corner, as though placed there without fanfare. In the kitchen, Abigail struggled with the fire and the feeding. At first the milk scorched, its smell clinging bitter to the pan, and Jonah wordlessly flung the ruined batch into the yard. But day by day her hand grew steadier, the flames less unruly, the milk less clotted. The child fed longer, her cries shortened, and Abigail felt the smallest satisfaction in mastering something so simple yet vital. One afternoon she sat by the window, repairing a torn curtain. Her needle moved in uneven lines, sunlight streaming through the hole like a wound long unstitched. Jonah passed behind her, meaning to slip away, but his eyes caught the movement of her hand, bent in quiet labor. For an instant, Mary's image flashed before him. Mary, sitting in that very chair, mending with the same bowed posture. The memory struck him sharp, as though past and present had collided. He turned away quickly, but that evening Abigail found a cup of tea waiting on the table. Hot, prepared, placed without word. She knew it was not meant for him. The firewood followed the same pattern. Though she never asked, the pile beside the door was always neatly stacked, dry and ready. Someone had split it early in the morning, each log cut even, though Jonah never mentioned it. Such gestures were small, almost invisible, yet they softened something in Abigail. The man who barely spoke, whose silence was heavy as the prairie sky, was beginning to leave behind signs of thoughtfulness he could not voice. Jonah himself seemed surprised by it, pausing a little longer in the doorway when she worked, his eyes restless before moving on. The child still cried often, her wails thin and piercing. Abigail learned to pace the floor with her, to hum broken melodies that steadied small breaths. Jonah tried too, but when he carried the baby she flailed and screamed harder, her face red with effort. One night he insisted, walking slow circles with her pressed against his chest. She howled until her tiny body quivered with exhaustion. At last, defeated, he returned her to Abigail. Within minutes of being cradled against her shoulder, soothed by that clumsy song, the child quieted, her eyelids fluttering shut. Jonah stood watching, silent, caught between relief and the ache of inadequacy. Gratitude touched him, but so did the sting of helplessness. He turned away, the shadows concealing his expression. And so the house shifted. Where grief had once laid thick and suffocating, a faint rhythm emerged. The sweep of a broom in the morning, the hiss of water over the fire at noon, the soft hum of lullabies at night. It was fragile as spider silk, yet it was life, and it had returned. One afternoon, Abigail carried a basket of damp laundry onto the porch. The sky was gray, the wind sharp as a blade against her cheek. Across the yard, Jonah swung an axe, splitting wood with a steady rhythm, his shirt clinging damp against the strain of muscle. He paused when their eyes met. She pressed her lips together, offering no word. He gave the smallest nod, then turned back to his work. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was simply space filled with the echo of unspoken understanding. That evening, as the child slept in the wicker cradle, Abigail sat mending one of Jonah's old shirts. Her stitches were uneven, but strong enough to hold. Jonah entered, reaching for his coat, and noticed the shirt folded neatly on the chair. He lifted it, his fingers brushing the fresh thread. For a moment his expression softened, though he said nothing. He merely pulled the garment on and walked out into the dark. From her seat by the hearth, Abigail caught the faint change in his features. A small smile ghosted across her lips. She had no need for thanks. It was enough to know the house now held traces of warmth again, no matter how faint. That night, the prairie wind roared against the shutters, fierce and unrelenting. Yet inside, the fire burned steady, its glow stretching across two figures who sat apart, but not estranged. Their eyes rested on the cradle between them, where the infant slept soundly. For the first time in weeks, peace, precious, precarious peace, settled in the Whitaker house. Abigail let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Jonah, still cloaked in silence, stared into the flames, but his eyes no longer reflected only loss. Something else had begun to take root there, small, uncertain, but undeniable. A quiet rhythm had entered their lives, too fragile to be named, too tenuous to be trusted. Yet it existed, and that was more than either of them had believed possible. The first days of April crept in with skies still heavy and low. The wind no longer cut so sharply, but clouds lingered over the prairie, pressing gray and weighty across the fields. In the Whitaker cabin, Abigail stood at the kitchen table, smoothing the paper in her hands. The list was smudged in places where damp air had blurred the ink, yet the handwriting remained precise, steady, evidence of her determination. Jonah had not asked for it. He had never spoken of wanting anyone else in the house. But Abigail knew her duty, both as a matchmaker and as Mary's friend. She had promised herself long ago that if ever Mary fell, she would not let the family fall with her. A child needed arms to cradle her, and a weary man needed someone to anchor him. That morning, the first woman came. She was a widow near 30, broad-shouldered, her face darkened by sun and work. She entered the house without hesitation, moving with the confidence of one who had long labored on farms. Without ceremony, she crossed the room to the cradle, pulled back the blanket, and lifted the infant in her calloused hands as though handling a bundle of hay. She studied the tiny reddened face, her lips twisting. "This one cries too much," she said flatly. "Hard to raise." Abigail's grip tightened around the paper in her hand. Jonah's eyes darkened. The woman placed the baby back, then began speaking briskly about acreage, about crop yields, about what land might profit if managed differently. Jonah cut her short, his voice cold as iron. "Thank you. That will be enough." The widow shrugged, disappointment etched plainly in her features. Her boots struck the floor heavily as she left, her gaze flicking one last time over the walls, the yard beyond, as if measuring rather than mourning. A few days later, the second candidate arrived. She was younger, cheeks touched with rouge, lips painted faintly, her perfume sweeping into the cabin like an invading storm. She smiled wide at Jonah, her gaze too bright, her manner too polished for a place like this. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice honeyed, "this ranch, it has such potential. With a woman's touch, it could become something altogether finer." She scooped the child up, cooing, rocking, with exaggerated care. She even hummed a tune, though her movements seemed meant for an audience. The baby squirmed under the thick cloud of perfume, wrinkled her face and let out a sharp wail. The young woman flinched, her smile faltering as she tried, clumsily, to hush the child. Jonah stepped forward, his expression carved in stone. He took the baby back with a single motion, his voice clipped, final. "You should go." The girl's painted smile vanished. She spun on her heel, her boots tapping sharp against the floorboards, leaving only the bitter scent of perfume in her wake. Abigail watched in silence, her heart tight with frustration. Yet she held her tongue. The third arrived on an afternoon touched with drizzle. She was perhaps 25, quiet, with a gentle face that seemed to fold in on itself. From the moment she entered, she kept her eyes lowered, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress. Abigail offered introductions. The young woman answered with brief nods, words too faint to carry. Jonah asked simple questions, yet her replies came halting, incomplete. When Abigail guided her to lift the child, her hands trembled so violently the baby nearly slipped from her grasp. Pale with fear, she returned the infant almost at once, shaking her head. Without farewell, she hurried out into the mist, her slight frame vanishing beyond the field. Silence returned to the house, thick and restless. Only the faint snuffle of the child remained. Abigail leaned against the table, her list clenched tight between her palms. Frustration surged, hot and uncontainable. She turned toward Jonah, her eyes bright with anger. "You aren't looking for a mother for her," she said, her voice breaking. "You won't give anyone a chance. You're afraid." Jonah held the baby close, his jaw tight. He did not speak at first, only gazed down at the eyes that brimmed with tears, the small body quivering in his arms. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, hollow. "I am not looking for someone to replace Mary." Abigail stepped forward, her own voice trembling with fury. "No one can replace Mary, but you cannot close the door forever. You push everyone away, not because they are unworthy, but because you are afraid to admit you cannot do this alone." The space between them stretched taut, charged like a storm. Jonah's body stiffened, his eyes flashed with an emotion he tried to bury, but the child's thin cry shattered the moment. He bent over, rocking gently, using the child as shield and refuge from Abigail's gaze. Her anger ebbed, but sorrow rose in its place. She knew how deep his grief ran. Yet his stubbornness wounded more than himself. It threatened the child as well. Rain thickened outside, tapping against the roof, the prairie wind howling through the cracks. Abigail stepped onto the porch, the cold rain striking her skin. She let it sting, let it wash through the fury and exhaustion. For an instant, she thought of Mary, and in that thought came the bitter certainty. Mary would never have wanted her family to stand fractured like this. Abigail re-entered quietly, shutting the door against the storm. She said nothing more, but she knew her words would remain with Jonah, cutting deeper than he would admit. What neither of them saw was the shadow left behind. Among the women who had come, one had not been simply a candidate. The first widow, practical and unbending, was kin to Jonah, some distant cousin who carried calculation in her eyes. She had not come to cradle a child or mend a home. She had come to measure, to weigh, to see what land might be gained if weakness held too long. Her boots had carried away more than one, disappointment. They carried knowledge and hunger. And though the cabin fell still again, a new kind of storm had already begun to circle the Whitaker ranch. The Dakota night was so still that even the wind sounded like whispers drifting from another world. Moonlight spread across the endless grasslands, silvering the prairie and casting the Whitaker cabin in sharp relief, one lonely structure holding its ground against the vast emptiness. Inside, the hearth had long since burned down, leaving only dull embers clinging to life. Shadows crowded the corners. Abigail sat at the kitchen table, her head bent over a torn scrap of cloth, the needle rising and falling with steady rhythm. She paused, frowning. The thread was too coarse for such delicate stitches. Setting the fabric aside, she opened the drawer in search of a finer spool. Her hand brushed against something unexpected, a narrow gap where the wood did not fit flush. Curious, she pressed lightly, and one plank shifted aside, revealing a small cavity hidden beneath. From within, she pulled a battered tin box. Its edges were bent, the paint long gone, only patches of dull metal remaining. Abigail froze, unsettled by the weight of the object in her hands. It was no tool of daily use. The secrecy of its place spoke louder than words. For a moment she hesitated. Then, drawn by a pull stronger than her own will, she opened the lid. The scent of old paper rose immediately, sharp and musty, heavy with time. Inside lay dozens of letters, carefully stacked. Some were yellowed, the corners curled. Others bore stains blurred by water, rain, perhaps, or tears. Abigail's fingers trembled as she lifted the top one. Jonah's handwriting stretched across the page, bold yet awkward, as if scratched down in haste but carved from sincerity. Mary, the nights in camp are endless. I write to you so my heart does not turn to stone. I cannot know when I'll return, but the thought of you is the one fire that keeps me alive. Abigail shut her eyes, her chest tightening. These were not just letters. They were fragments of Jonah's soul, words written in solitude, carried by longing, but never sent. A man's heart bound in ink, hidden in a box. She read another. Lines of devotion, aching loneliness. Then sudden scratches where words had been struck out so violently the paper tore. Another letter carried fear. Another, a plea for endurance. Together they painted a portrait of a man raw and exposed, not the stone-faced widower who haunted the halls of this house. Near the bottom lay a newer envelope. Its paper was still pale, barely touched by age. Abigail unfolded it, her breath unsteady. The ink was smudged, as if written too quickly, the hand shaking. I cannot give her a name. If I love her, I will lose her. Mary, you are gone, and I am left at the edge of an abyss. Each time I look at the child, I see you, and I see the blade waiting above me. To love her is to risk another loss, and I cannot survive it a second time. Abigail's body went rigid. The candle flame quivered, painting her face pale as bone. The words carved into her like a knife. Now she understood. Jonah's coldness was not hatred, not rejection of his daughter. It was terror. Terror that love, once given, would only destroy him again. A floorboard creaked. Abigail spun around. Jonah stood in the dark hallway, his figure cut in shadow, his eyes hollow and burning. They fixed first on the paper in her hand, then on the open box. His expression shifted, shock, anger, and something deeper, raw, before it froze into a mask. "What are you doing?" His voice came low, harsh, like a growl dragged from deep within. Abigail tried to place the letter back, but her hands shook. "I was only looking for thread." I didn't know this was here." In 3 strides he was at the table. He snatched the letter from her grasp, his hands trembling as he shoved it back into the box. The lid clanged shut with a hollow snap. "No one is meant to read these," he said, his voice hoarse with rage and something dangerously close to pain. The great breadth of his shoulders shuddered, his face flushed with heat, yet his eyes betrayed him. They were not only furious, they were wounded, exposed. Abigail straightened, her palms clenched. "Those words are not only for Mary. They are part of you, Jonah. If you bury them, you will drown in the darkness you've made for yourself." "You understand nothing," he bit out. "I understand more than you think." Her tone softened, weighted with both compassion and resolve. "I see your fear. You believe if you love the child, you'll lose her. But don't you see? It is the fear itself that's destroying you, and her." Jonah's jaw tightened. He stared at the box as though it were a brand he longed to cast into the fire yet could not. His fingers trembled around it, his silence thicker than the shadows pressing the room. Abigail stepped closer, her voice dropping. "No one writes to the dead unless they still wish to live. You can hide from me, but not from yourself." For a long moment he stood frozen, as though her words had pierced through to a place he refused to admit existed. Then he lifted his gaze, eyes dark and fathomless. "Stay out of this," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Never touch them again." He turned, his steps heavy, retreating down the hall. A door slammed shut, the echo lingering long after. Abigail remained at the table, her chest rising and falling, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She had not meant to trespass, yet now she carried knowledge that could not be undone. Jonah was not only a grieving widower, he was a man shackled by his own terror, chained to memories that would not release him. Her hand rested on the tin box, its metal cold under her palm. The words she had read still burned in her mind. "I cannot give her a name." Moonlight streamed through a crack in the shutters, falling across her face, tired yet resolute. Abigail understood then. The box was not simply a secret. It was a key. To Jonah's pain, to the child's future, to whatever fragile hope might still be saved in this place. The night stretched on, long and heavy. Outside, the wind rose across the Dakota plain. But inside the Whitaker cabin, Abigail knew she had stepped across a threshold. She had touched the deepest part of Jonah's darkness, and the storms ahead would not come only from the prairie sky. The slam of Jonah's door echoed long after he vanished down the hallway. Abigail remained at the kitchen table, both palms pressed against the wood. The chill of the tin box seared into her skin. Candlelight wavered, throwing her shadow tall across the wall, stretched thin like a soul caught between trial and surrender. She had never meant to trespass into his grief. Yet once the letters lay bare before her, their words struck like hammers, each line pounding deeper until her chest ached. She tried to close her eyes, but the weight of them pulsed behind her lids. In the cradle, the baby stirred, her breath faint, threading with the moan of wind pressing against the cabin walls. At last, Abigail's trembling fingers returned to the box. She eased the lid open once more. Inside, envelopes lay stacked, fragile fragments of a life unfinished. She hesitated, heart beating hard, then drew one from near the bottom. Its paper had yellowed, its ink pale, but the writing was not Jonah's. The script was graceful, feminine. Abigail's chest constricted. She knew it instantly. Mary's hand. Her breath shortened as she scanned the opening lines. Abigail, if you are reading this, it means I could not remain at Jonah's side. You once knew me better than words could carry. You understood me in silence. Jonah is strong, but his heart is more fragile than he admits. If the day comes when I am gone, I ask you not to let him fall. Do not let this house turn to ashes. The words blurred as tears stung her vision. Memories flooded. Their youth in Helena, teaching children in the church schoolroom. Mary, soft-spoken, gentle, but with shadows in her eyes that no one else ever noticed. She had handed Abigail this burden years ago, without her knowledge. Only now did the weight settle fully. A sound behind her snapped Abigail's head up. Jonah stood at the doorway, his frame carved by lamplight into something darker than shadow. His eyes locked onto the letter clutched in her hands. He surged forward, yanking it from her grasp, his voice roughened by fury. I told you never to touch them. Abigail did not flinch. Her chest rose and fell, but her gaze held steady. You can tear it, you can bury it, but the truth remains. Mary trusted me. She left you in my keeping. Jonah froze, the paper crumpling in his grip. His shoulders shook, his eyes wild with disbelief and pain. You lie. No. Her reply was hoarse but sure. I have no reason to invent this. Mary wrote it herself. She knew you wouldn't survive losing her unless someone stood beside you. And she was right. He staggered backward as if the floor had cracked beneath him, collapsing into a chair, one hand covering his brow. His voice rasped out, broken. She never told me, not once. Abigail's heart clenched with both pity and anger. Did you think Mary could not see your fear? I saw it, and I was not her wife. She left her words not to haunt you, but to remind you that you're not alone. Yet you lock yourself away, drive everyone out. The air thickened, heavy as storm clouds. The baby began to fuss, her cry rising sharp through the tension. Jonah lurched toward the cradle, reaching with trembling arms, but his hands shook so badly the child only wailed louder. Abigail stepped forward, gathering the baby smoothly against her chest. She rocked gently, humming, her voice fragile but steady. Slowly the child's sobs dwindled, her small body easing against Abigail's warmth. Jonah stood motionless, watching as if the air had been stolen from his lungs. You see? Abigail whispered, her eyes never leaving the child. Mary was right. You cannot do this alone. No one can. Jonah shut his eyes tight, breath harsh and uneven. He turned away, the letter crumpled in his hand, anger now turned inward, against his helplessness, against the unbearable truth that Mary had seen through him all along. When at last he spoke, it was low, ragged. I don't know what to do with this. If she trusted you, why did she never say it to me? Abigail lowered the baby back into the cradle, tucking the blanket around her. She turned, her voice calm yet unyielding. Because she knew you would never accept it. She left the words with me so one day, when you needed them most, you would hear what you refused to face. That day is now. Jonah's head dropped into his hand, the letter trembling in his fist. Pain, anger, and fear twisted together, tightening until he could hardly breathe. Yet somewhere deep inside, something cracked. The first fissure in the walls he had built. Abigail stepped back, giving him the space he needed, but her eyes held a quiet resolve. Mary had given her this charge. The prairie wind that night was not violent, yet it would not relent. It threaded through every crack of the Whitaker cabin, humming a tired refrain that refused to cease. In the kitchen, the fire in the stove had dwindled to embers, their glow painting Abigail's face in weary reds and shadows. The quarrel lingered still, each word like a nail hammered into her chest. Jonah's voice, hard and cutting, replayed over and over. "You have no right to dig into my past. You are not Mary." Abigail sat unmoving, her hands trembling faintly against her lap. For weeks she had measured her breath, held her temper, offered patience. She had stood near him, carried burdens not hers to carry, believing perhaps her presence could loosen the weight around him. But what had she met in return? A wall. Thick, impenetrable, and merciless. Not even the memory of Mary seemed able to pierce it. At last she rose. Her steps, heavy with resolve, carried her down the narrow hall to the small room she had claimed. In the dim glow of her candle, she pulled a leather satchel from beneath the bed. One by one she folded her few dresses, placing them carefully inside. Each motion was deliberate, not rushed, as though she were laying to rest the fragile hope she had carried since first stepping into this house. On the kitchen table she left behind another list. Clean, crisp, the names written neatly as always. Candidates, possible wives, possible mothers, a replacement for what Jonah refused to seek for himself. But this time, there was no place for her own name among them. Her pen had faltered there. A moment of bitter thought had pierced her as she wrote the last line. She had spent a lifetime arranging unions for others, never once considering her own. And when, at last, she had secretly let herself imagine a place here, she had been forced to erase it. Cut it clean, like trimming away a thread that hung loose. The baby's cry broke into the silence, thin and persistent from the other room. Abigail froze. She heard the scrape of Jonah's chair, the shuffle of his boots, the clumsy attempts at soothing. "Shh. Hush now. Please, just hush." His voice cracked, pleading, but the cries only rose higher, filling the house with a relentless grief that no hand seemed able to calm. Abigail pressed her eyes shut, her fists clenching the fabric of her skirt. Instinct begged her to go, to lift the child as she had so many times before, but her decision held her fast. She had chosen. She would not break. In the main room, Jonah paced with the child. His face was pale, damp with sweat. The infant's cheeks burned scarlet, her tiny body convulsing with sobs that grew raw and hoarse. He tried singing, but the tune collapsed under the strain of his throat, more broken plea than lullaby. He laid her down, only for her to scream louder. He lifted her again, stumbling across the floor, then sank into a chair, his arms tightening around her. The sound shredded him. Each cry seemed to cut into his chest, his heart twisting until tears burned his eyes. "Mary, where are you?" The cry rose inside him, silent and desperate. Only the infant's sobs answered, piercing, merciless. His gaze lifted toward Abigail's door. The faint glow of her candle leaked through the crack, steady, unreachable. The urge swelled to knock, to beg her to come, to call her name. But pride, stubborn, bitter pride, held him still. Pride and the fear of what it would mean to need her. In her room, Abigail sat rigid on the bed. Her eyes brimmed, but she bit her lip until the taste of iron filled her mouth. Each wail, Hasama wail, cut through her, sharp and unyielding. Yet she forced herself to remain still. Jonah had to face it. If she stepped in again, he would never learn. She could not be his crutch forever. Time crawled, weighted and cruel. The wind outside scraped along the siding, clawed at the shutters. Inside, the child's cries weakened, breaking into ragged hiccups. Jonah sank down onto the floorboards, his back against the chair, clutching his daughter tight. His tears fell freely, darkening the thin blanket wrapped around her. Never had he felt so powerless. He had once stood in battle, musket firm in hand, his courage unbroken. Yet here, against the sobs of his own blood, he shook like a leaf. Every ounce of strength had bled away with Mary, leaving him a hollow man clinging to what little remained. And in that hollow moment, a terrible truth settled over him. The only reason this house still drew breath, the only reason hope had flickered at all, was because of the woman now packing to leave. Abigail heard it, the breaking of him, muffled through the thin wall. She pressed her trembling hands against the last dress, folding it tight. Her lips shaped words of farewell she could not speak aloud. Her throat locked against them, choked by sorrow and resolve alike. She placed her palm against her chest, drew a long, shuddering breath. Tomorrow, before the sun climbed the prairie sky, she would be gone. That night, no one slept. Jonah sat on the floor, his daughter limp against him, her tiny sobs fading to fitful sighs. His eyes stared blankly into the dying fire, hollow and endless. Abigail lay on her narrow bed, turned toward the wall, her eyes open wide. Each time Jonah's weary breath broke the silence, it lanced through her. Between the thin boards of the house, two souls lay torn, one trapped within chains of grief and pride, the other bound by the choice to walk away. And between them, the child's fragile breathing echoed, insistent and unyielding, a heartbeat demanding love, whether they were ready to give it or not. Morning came heavy with gray. The Dakota sky sagged low, clouds massing from the north, pressing so close it seemed one could reach up and tear a piece away. Abigail closed the door to her small room with her satchel already packed and slung over her shoulder. On the table behind her lay the fresh list she had prepared the night before. New names, neat ink, but not her own among them. She did not look back. Stepping onto the porch, she lowered her eyes to the dirt road stretching toward the edge of the property. The wind carried with it a sharp scent, dry and metallic, the smell of snow waiting to fall. Her heart felt like stone. "It is time," she whispered inwardly. "I cannot stay, not another step deeper." Her boots crunched over the hard ground, each stride pulling her away from the cabin, away from the fragile hope she had once dared to cradle. Then came the cry. Not the thin whimper of a restless infant, but a full, ragged scream, raw, hoarse, desperate. It tore through the stillness like the wail of a soul on fire. Abigail stopped mid-step. The sound raked through her chest until she could hardly breathe. The door banged open behind her. Jonah stumbled out. The child clutched tight in his arms. His hair was wild, his face ashen, eyes rimmed red from sleeplessness. The baby flailed, her skin flushed, cries rasping with pain. Jonah's voice, flung into the rising wind, broke against her ears. "Not another name on a list. I want you." Abigail's feet rooted to the earth. Slowly she turned, seeing him standing there, the storm of fear plain in every line of his body. Then the wind rose. A sharp blast cut across the plain, carrying the first whip of snow. Within moments, the sky cracked open, and the storm descended with a vengeance. Flakes pelted like shards, the gale driving white curtains sideways until the world vanished. Jonah staggered forward, shouting through the howl, "She's burning up! She's fevered!" Abigail dropped her satchel and ran back. Together they wrestled against the wind, stumbling inside as the door slammed hard against its frame. Outside, the blizzard roared, battering the cabin walls like fists of ice. The baby screamed, her tiny body hot against Abigail's palms. She pressed her hand to the child's forehead and gasped, "Jonah! She's burning alive with fever!" There was no doctor within miles, no medicine. Only the old wood walls, the fire, and what their hands could manage. Jonah knelt at the hearth, fumbling with flint and kindling until the fire roared back to life. Abigail fetched a basin, dipped cloths in water gone cold, and wrung them out quickly, laying them against the baby's head. Back and forth they moved, he feeding logs to the fire, she changing cloths, whispering broken lullabies. The wind outside screamed like wolves, but within another battle raged, each breath of the child a fragile thread threatening to snap. Jonah collapsed into a chair, the baby in his arms, his whole frame trembling. Her chest, "It's too fast. If anything happens..." His voice cracked, strangled by terror. Abigail knelt beside him, her hand gripping his arm. "Do not say it. She will endure. We will keep the fire. Jonah, you must believe it." The child convulsed with sobs, her cries reduced to a rasp. Abigail gathered her close, pressing her to her breast, rocking with words half formed, half prayer. Jonah leaned forward, his fists white, his eyes fixed as though the sight of his daughter was the only thing binding him to earth. Hours dragged. The storm beat harder. They took turns holding her, dabbing her brow, whispering through their fear. Abigail saw Jonah's hands shake as he touched his child's cheek, saw his eyes swimming not with smoke but with tears. At the storm's height, Jonah bent low, his lips trembling against the baby's ear. "Don't leave me. I cannot bear another loss. Please, not again." His voice broke into a sob, the confession raw, torn from the depths of his chest. Abigail's throat tightened. She shifted the baby so both their arms could encircle her, pressing Jonah's trembling hands against her own. "She's not alone. Neither are you," she whispered. And then, in that fragile circle of firelight, something shifted. The baby's breathing softened, her cries fading to whimpers, then to silence. Her tiny body slackened into sleep, still hot but no longer searing. Jonah collapsed forward, his shoulders shaking, one hand clapped over his face. A broken sound escaped him, half relief, half exhaustion. Abigail held the baby steady, her own tears falling freely. When Jonah lifted his head, his eyes were wet but clear, lit by something she had never seen in him before. He looked from the child to Abigail, and through the roar of the wind, his voice came rough, unsteady, yet certain. "Her name is Grace, because you brought grace into this house." Abigail froze, her breath catching. The word hung in the air, luminous, fragile, more powerful than any she had heard since setting foot on this land. A name. At last, he had given his daughter a name. Her tears spilled unchecked. She kissed the child's damp forehead, whispering, "Grace, our Grace." The storm outside raged on, but within the fire held, and three figures huddled close, no longer fragments bound only by loss, but a circle bound by something new. When dawn came, the sky broke open, blazing white over a world transformed. Snow blanketed the fields in silence, the air sharp and clear. Abigail leaned against the wall, Grace in her arms. Jonah slumped beside her, his head bowed in exhausted sleep. The house was quiet, yet not with the suffocating quiet of before. Now it carried the hush of survival, the breath of a new beginning. A name had been spoken, and with it, a promise had been made. Jonah Whitaker was no longer merely a man marked by death. He had chosen, trembling and raw, to love again. And in that choice the storm had given back more than it had taken. Dawn spilled a pale band of gold across the snowbound prairie. The storm had passed, leaving the land buried under drifts that sparkled with a brittle, deceptive calm. Above the fields, the sun pressed weakly against gray clouds, its light softer than usual, like a gift after a night of fury. The Whitaker cabin crouched beneath the weight of snow piled high against its porch, but smoke from the chimney marked the hearth alive. Inside, Jonah sat at the kitchen table. Before him lay a sheet of fresh paper, blank, waiting. A quill rested at his side. He looked hollow from the night, his shirt still carrying the faint acrid smoke of the fire, shadows carved deep under his eyes. Yet there was something different in him. Beneath the exhaustion, a kind of clarity had taken root. His face was drawn, but his gaze carried a quiet decision, as though the storm had scoured him bare and left behind a man who finally knew where he stood. Abigail entered the kitchen, Grace nestled in her arms. The baby's fever had broken, though her skin remained warm to the touch. She slept deeply now, cheeks pink, lips parted around the rhythm of her breath. Abigail lowered her carefully into the wicker cradle near the fire, tucked an extra quilt around her, and only then approached Jonah. Her eyes flicked toward the paper, the quill, the set of his shoulders. "You're going to write?" she asked softly. Jonah nodded once, his jaw tight. "A letter. To Helena's matchmaking office. It's time to end it." Abigail froze, her chest stilled around the beat of her heart. Jonah drew a long breath, dipped the quill, and began. His hand moved slow, heavy, as if each word was carved into the page with the weight of stone. His voice rasped low as he sounded the words aloud, deliberate and certain. "To the office of Helena, I hereby cancel all arrangements." He paused, the nib hovering. Then he continued, voice unsteady yet resolute. "The woman I need was never on paper. She does not come from a list. She is here, in this house." His hand fell. The quill clattered gently against the ink bottle. His broad shoulders sagged, as though the confession had cost him the last of his strength. Abigail stood silent, her throat tightening. Her fingers reached for the page, almost of their own accord. "Let me write it," she whispered. Jonah lifted his eyes to her, a storm of conflict swirling there, fear and longing, hope and dread. After a moment, he slid the quill toward her, the smallest nod ceding ground he never thought he would. Abigail lowered herself onto the bench beside him. She dipped the quill, steadied her trembling hand, and copied his words in her clear, even script. Each line cut deep, each letter carrying the weight of his surrender. "The woman I need was never on paper." The phrase echoed in her mind, a refrain she could neither escape nor silence. When the letter was finished, she laid the quill aside. Jonah leaned in to read, his lips moving soundlessly across the lines. Then, with a voice gone rough, he added aloud, not from the page but from his chest. The woman I need is not here to replace Mary, not to guard the door, stir the pot, or hush a child. She is the one who has looked into my pain and not turned away. She is the one who stayed when I pushed her off, the one who held on through the storm, the one who brought grace to this house. The words trembled at the edges, breaking almost to a whisper by the end. Abigail's eyes blurred. She bent her head, unable to hide the heat burning behind her lids. You don't have to say so much, she murmured. I do, Jonah answered, his fist tapping once against the table as if to ground himself. If I do not speak today, I may never find the courage again. They sat together in the silence that followed, broken only by the gentle pop of the fire. From the cradle, Grace stirred, loosed a tiny yawn, then settled once more. Abigail folded the letter carefully, sealing it inside a plain envelope. Her hand shook as she wrote the address, something she had done hundreds of times for others, never once for herself. This one felt heavier than them all. Jonah laid his palm across the envelope, rough skin against her fine script. When the snow clears, I will send it, he said. His eyes found hers, steady despite the tremor in his voice. There is no road back from this. Abigail nodded faintly, though her heart thudded wild in her chest. For the first time she saw in him not a man chained to grief, but one who had chosen, however haltingly, to step toward hope. Outside, the sun climbed higher, striking fire from the snowbanks. The world glittered white, silent, waiting. Within the cabin, the air shifted, carrying with it the breath of a beginning. That evening, after chores had been done and the baby fed, Jonah returned to the table. The lamplight cast his shadow tall across the wall, no longer solitary, but grounded. Abigail sat opposite, her needle flashing as she finished a seam. He spoke then, voice low but sure. I thought if Mary were alive, she would want me to guard the grief, to hold to it, as though it were all I had left of her. But I see now, she would want me to guard the living, to guard this family. And this family, he paused, eyes lifting to meet hers, is no longer just me. Abigail's hands stilled, the needle poised midair. Jonah drew a breath, the sound raw, unpolished. I thought I died with her, but last night, when Grace burned with fever, I knew I still lived. I live for her. His eyes softened, lingering on Abigail. And for you. The words fell between them like embers catching flame. The fire surged in the hearth, answering in sparks. Abigail looked down quickly, but her vision shimmered. Her needle slipped from her grasp, forgotten. Outside, the prairie slept beneath its new coat of snow. The wind had stilled, the moonlight crisp and clear. And inside the Whitaker home, a letter lay waiting. More than a notice of cancellation, more than ink and paper. It was a declaration, a man choosing light after years of darkness, and beside him, the woman who had carried the pen, her trembling hand writing the words he could not bear alone. Summer returned to Dakota with a gentler hand than winter had ever allowed. Wheat fields rolled golden across the prairie, the stalks whispering in the breeze. Hay bales rose in neat stacks as tall as a man's shoulders, and the wind that once cut like a blade now swept soft and open, carrying warmth instead of warning. Morning sunlight fell across the small town, glinting on the clapboard fronts of shops, brightening the wide wooden porch of the general store, while hooves rang steady against the dirt road. At the corner of the main street stood a modest photography shop, its faded green sign swaying gently above the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of chemicals and wood polish. Black and white portraits hung on the walls. Stern fathers, rigid mothers, children posed like tiny sentinels. Each frame was a frozen testimony to the families of the frontier. Jonah stood stiffly in the center of the room. He wore a clean white shirt, collar starched, sleeves smoothed. His beard had been trimmed, his hair combed back, though the awkwardness in his posture betrayed how unnatural it felt. His calloused hands fumbled at the hem of his shirt, as if even fabric pressed too fine made him restless. Beside him, Abigail wore a simple cotton dress the color of sky after rain. No lace, no frills, only a narrow ribbon tied at her waist. Grace nestled in her arms, cheeks full, eyes round, mouth curled into a half-smile that wavered toward laughter. The baby's small fingers clutched the ribbon as if it were a treasure. The photographer cleared his throat, adjusted the tripod, and raised his voice with the solemnity of ritual. "Hold still, just one flash, no movement." Jonah drew himself rigid, jaw tight, staring forward. Abigail tilted her shoulder so Grace could face the camera. The child let out a sudden giggle, her hands flapping against the air. In that instant, the room brightened, not with sunlight, but with her laughter. Jonah's stern facade cracked. His lips curved into a crooked smile, clumsy but genuine. And at that precise moment, the bulb flared, the portrait caught, sealed in silver and shadow. A family, no longer fractured. Later that afternoon, back at the ranch, the small framed photograph was placed carefully upon the shelf above the hearth. Beside it rested the old tin box, dented corners, paint flaking. It had once hidden unsent letters, words soaked in grief. Now it held memory, not secrecy. And atop it, the new photograph gleamed, not as a cover, but as a crown. A period marking the end of loss, and a beginning written in light. Abigail stood before it, her eyes shimmering as she studied her own likeness frozen on the paper. Her whisper carried low, trembling but steady. "I've found my harbor." Jonah stepped near, his broad hand pressing lightly against her shoulder. He leaned down, his voice grave, deliberate. "Not because of lists, not because of Mary, because you stayed." She turned, a smile flickering faintly. No further words were needed. In the weeks that followed, life on the Whitaker place shifted into a rhythm that felt both new and deeply earned. Morning broke with the rooster's crow. Grace practiced rolling on a small rug near the fire, eyes wide at the world around her. Abigail guided her little hands, coaxing first syllables that came as bright bursts of sound. Jonah repaired fences, mucked stalls, but more often than not, his gaze strayed toward the cabin, where the sound of laughter carried farther than any hammer strike. In the afternoons, Jonah would return with wildflowers clutched awkwardly, their stems wrapped in twine. He placed them into a chipped porcelain vase on the table, each bouquet a wordless offering. Abigail brewed tea, her hands now free of matchmaking lists, her fingers laced instead with his across the wood grain. Nights were not without challenge. Grace still woke with sudden cries, But no longer did either parent face the darkness alone. They rose together, passing the child between them, rocking, humming, waiting out the long hours until her breathing softened. The fire threw tall shadows against the wall. 3 figures bent close, blurred yet unbroken, silent testimony of a bond no storm could erase.